Hi friends! Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best works of the social left and debate the policy positions of the movement we create together. In last week's episode, we celebrated Bernie Sanders' announcement of him entering the race and his bill on expanding Social Security, while also proving that we as fans are not above criticizing our own when we respectfully disagree on the policy positions that they support and that they are not aligned with the will of the American people. Going forward, as I've been learning to make content for the first time, the structure of the show will become further honed. This past week, I came to the decision that to keep the show consistent for you all, timing-wise, I'll be doing two different recurring segments. So the first is going to be a discussion of a new thing that I'm going to be releasing, which is going to be a weekly poll on a topic of policy or current events so that we can discuss and debate and celebrate even the best solutions for our movement. Then we'll be wrapping up our shows like we have been doing by celebrating the works of the social left community. With those details out of the way, let's turn to our work to celebrate for this week, as you're going to need to look out for the first poll to drop once this episode is released. And side note, please remember we will be featuring the best commentary provided on the poll in our upcoming episodes. So if you want to be included in any of these episodes, make sure you look out for that poll to drop and make sure you leave a comment. So in this week's episode, we'll be giving some grades on the Bernie Sanders CNN town hall that had 1.4 million people watch it and generated some controversy over CNN's failure to properly disclose the heavy political backgrounds of some of their participants. If you want to find out more information on the actual controversy of CNN's failure to disclose this information on their question-asking participants, I highly recommend you check out some channels who have already done analysis on this, like Secular Talk, The Humanist Report, Jimmy Dore, TYT, or David Pakman. My short opinion on the matter is let's please not harass these people. It really makes our base look like a bunch of assholes if we fling hate at any person asking questions of our candidates, because they should be able to handle it on their own on the stage. And let's put more of the onus on CNN for that failure to disclose that they wanted to give you the perspective of individuals with a heavy political industry connection rather than just average Americans. Telling people who the individuals are, I believe, is okay so that we have context on why certain issues to them may be more important than others because of the backgrounds that they hold. But we must work together to ensure that any person who is harassing these individuals with abusive language or action are strictly condemned. So, when grading the subject of the debate, I'll be giving out two grades. One is the overall importance of the question being asked, and then secondly, I'll grade the answer that Bernie gave, and then at the end, we'll tally up the grades to see how they did. Spoiler alert, Bernie did really well, otherwise we wouldn't be celebrating this as the Hill of Roses. Furthermore, for the sake of time and to try and avoid potential copyright infringements, I'm only going to be showing you Bernie's top 3 and bottom 3 answers to the 27 questions that were posed to him. So, now to the first question. I'm going to show you some video of that.
Sheila Ruth of Maryland, go ahead.
Hi. This is an unusual election, and unfortunately, we can't focus only on the issues. We must get President Trump out of the White House before he does any more damage. If you are the Democratic nominee, how will you defeat him? And if you are not the nominee, what will you do to help the nominee defeat him?
So, basically, the question asked is a simple one. How do you plan to defeat Trump? And if you're not the nominee, how do you plan to support the nominee to beat Trump? For this question, I'm going to give this an A. I think it's a very straightforward question that any candidate is going to need to answer. Beating Trump is the first and foremost objective for us to get any progress towards what we want to accomplish, because we need someone with a pen who is not going to be striking down policies that we want to implement. So although it's a simple question, everyone's going to be asked this, it's still very important nonetheless, and it affirms that he is committing that if he doesn't get the nomination, that he's going to support whoever does win. So that gets an A. So then Bernie basically answered that he pledged to work behind whoever is the nominee of the Democratic Party regardless, although he obviously hopes it'll be himself, and that if he is the one to take him on, he's going to be going after him on Trump's plan to take healthcare away from Americans, his cutting of taxes for the rich, and his cutting of Social Security, which all went against his own campaign promises back in 2016, as well as focusing on the fact that Trump really spends a lot of his effort on trying to divide us up by our identities. I think that this deserves an A- of a grade. It's a pretty good answer. It affirms that he is going to commit to whoever the nominee is. It also affirms what he's going to focus on, which is Trump breaking his campaign promises if he was the nominee. But I think one thing he failed to do was mention getting out voters who didn't vote last time because they stayed at home. With the movement that we're building, we believe that in a general election, we can get increased turnout and therefore an increased chance of having Democrats win. So this will now turn to our second question. Let's have a watch.
Ebersol, a former biology professor from Baltimore County, Maryland. Tara, go ahead.
Good evening. There's a lot of misinformation regarding your plan for universal health care. Would you please provide a brief overview of your plan and how it differs from that of other candidates?
Good.
Thank you.
So this question is pretty good. It's there's basically a lot of misinformation around your plan for universal health care. Can you basically provide us an overview and how it's differentiated from that of the other candidates? So I believe this question deserves an A. Two reasons. I think the framing of the question is actually pretty good because by stating that there is misinformation, it comes from both sides, both from potential supporters giving details that aren't true, as well as from critics who are also spreading misinformation. So it's a clearing of the air without a partisanship of which side you support. And then it also goes into, well, what's the difference between your plan and what all these other Democrats are advocating for now that a bunch of them have joined on board for Medicare for all, but some of them have watered down versions, and so it's good to be able to give that distinction. So then I would say this happens to be one of Bernie's top 3 answers, so we're going to show you some of that video now.
The United States, shamefully, is the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people. We've got 30 million people today without any health insurance. Many of you are underinsured with high deductibles and high copayments, and we pay the highest prices in the world by far for prescription drugs. So, issue number 1, I believe that health care is a human right, not a privilege, and we've got to guarantee health care to all of our people as a right. Number 2, if we're going to do that in a cost-effective way, if we're going to make sure that we are not spending huge amounts of money, and in fact, lower the amount of money we're spending. We're now spending almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as any other country. That is unsustainable. The estimates is that in the next 10 years, we're going to spend $50 trillion on healthcare. The only way to provide healthcare to all people in a cost-effective way is a Medicare for all single-payer program. All right? That's what I believe. And that's what I will fight for. Now, good news is, before I ran for president in 2016, that was considered to be a wild and crazy idea. Today, a significant majority of the people support that concept. Now, the drug companies don't. The insurance companies don't, because they make billions of dollars every single year off of our wasteful and dysfunctional healthcare system. So I'm going to fight as hard as I can. There's going to be a bill introduced in the House, I believe this week, over 100 co-sponsors. We're going to reintroduce a bill in the Senate, I believe 16 co-sponsors. We are making real progress.
So as you can see, he basically goes into a pretty traditional framing at the start of the conversation that he usually uses when supporting Medicare for all, starting off saying that we're the only major country on earth without universal health care, that we have the highest cost per capita, more than twice the next highest country, and that healthcare needs to be looked at more as a right that all people should be afforded rather than a product that can be serviced for those that can afford it. to lower healthcare costs, he believes that a Medicare for all single-payer system is the most effective solution, and studies bear that out. He quotes a figure of the current cost of healthcare costing $50 trillion over the next 10 years, compared to the results of the Medicare for All program of $32 trillion over the next 10 years, an $18 trillion saving over a decade, or a $1.8 trillion saving each year, which, in my opinion and Bernie's opinion here, it becomes less of a question of how do we pay for this and more how don't we pay for this? It's a cost-saving solution, and this once radical idea has now finally been embraced by the majority of Americans, including even 51% of Republicans. It's basically time to embrace this solution, which there's current bills out there in the House with 100 co-sponsors and a bill that's currently sitting in the Senate with 16 co-sponsors. So then Wolf basically gives him a follow-up asking if people who have private insurance, who like their plans, if they're going to have to lose that plan if his new system is implemented. And I think this is why it deserves being one of the top 3 answers. Him framing the question as, you're not getting a change in how your healthcare results are provided. You're still keeping your doctor. You're still keeping your hospital. What's changing is the color of your card, and that no one really likes their healthcare insurance. They like the healthcare that's actually provided in the end, and they don't want to have to worry about all of the actual copays that come each time, in addition to the exorbitant premiums that they already face. He furthermore expands that for the people currently receiving Medicare, the elderly, there's going to actually be expansions as well to those services offered, including, having a health insurance plan that includes dental, eyeglasses, and hearing aids as well, which are very needed services for our elderly. He also believes, when pressed further by Wolf on whether or not private insurance will be allowed at all, he basically answered that no, we need that increased negotiating power, but you can still have your private insurance when it comes to getting things like cosmetic surgeries. So being a top 3 answer, this obviously is getting an A. So let's now go to our third question.
From Julius Washington. He's a freshman at Howard University here in Washington, but he's originally from your hometown of Brooklyn, New York.
Many of your policies have been met with speculation about how they're going to be paid for. What would you propose as solutions to pay for your ambitious policy ideals?
So basically, this question is, how do you pay for your ambitious ideas? I think this question deserves a B+, because it's an important question. How do we actually pay for the solutions that we want? And Bernie does have those solutions on his website provided for each of the policies. The one reason why it gets a slight knock is this is a question that is all too often only asked to progressives compared to more centrist or even Republicans, compared to topics like how do we keep paying for the increases in our military spending now that we spend, I believe it's $718 billion on our military each year, with an $80 billion increase, which has led to a larger amount than the actual cost of paying for free college for a year, for example. It never asks, how do we keep paying all of these bailouts that we give to companies or corporate subsidies to the gas companies? That's a question that all too often is only framed against progressives and never for something else like, giving tax cuts to the most wealthy. So it's a fair question and why it gets a B+, but because this is a question that is almost only ever posed to Bernie and not the other candidates, I did give it a slight knock. So then Bernie basically answers that we have more income and wealth inequality in our country than ever beforehand, that the top 3 families now own more than the bottom 50% combined, and that we have to emphasize the need to fix the issues at hand with our spending rather than giving these wealthy individuals and corporations tax cuts. He then brings up a very famous example of Amazon, and he gets the crowd involved asking, do you know how much they pay in taxes? And the crowd, roariously says 0. And I thought that was quite effective personally, because you want, when you are on stage, to be showing that you are the voice of the people. And there's no more effective way than when you're making a point, getting the people to literally chime in for that point that you're making. Wolf decides to give a little bit of a follow-up here. He asks, well, it's great and all that you're going to say the rich are going to pay for this, but how do you get them to pay for it? They're already trying to avoid it. And Bernie responds that he's going to try and end the tax loopholes that these major corporations and billionaires are storing money in tax-free havens like the Cayman Islands. This process is known as inversions. And so I think Bernie deserves an A- here. The only knock I would give on his answer is he didn't specify how he plans to actually fight these corporate inversions without capital fleeing before the new laws are implemented. So then we'll go to our fourth question now.
We have a question from Shadi Nassab, a student at American University. Shadi's from Denver.
As we saw in the 2018 midterms, the Democratic Party has become more female, more racially diverse, and younger in age. How can a voter like me feel confident in your ability to represent the party, especially given that your response to sexual harassment allegations during your campaign is that you were, quote, a little bit busy running around the country trying to make the case to be elected as president?
Well,
so as you could see with this question, this is a pretty biased way of framing a question to Bernie. It basically is, Bernie, why are you not a young woman of color? And why should we trust you to be the nominee when you allowed sexual harassment on your own campaign? So I'm going to give this question a D. So I think it's important that we do make some mention of why it's important that, even though Bernie, being an older white man, explain why we need to look past just our identity and look to our policy. So asking a question on why we as a party who is, compared to the Republican Party, more female and more ethnic, why should we have you as our standard bearer? So I think that is fair, and it's why I'm not going to just give an overt F. However, it kind of is an unfair push on him when he has had policies that help those groups more, and there's nothing he can do to help the fact that he is old and white and a man. The second part of the question I take more issue with in the sexual harassment thing, because this is an issue that has only been propped up against Bernie Sanders. Yes, there was a sexual harassment incident in his campaign in some of the Latina outreach group within Nevada, and that wasn't properly handled. And he has now heard from those victims and admits as much, and how it caused him a severe amount of pain. But this is an issue that goes way beyond just Bernie's campaign. It has been an issue for political campaigns throughout history, and even still to today. Hillary Clinton's campaign has faced it, and even campaigns today like Kamala Harris have recently had this type of a scandal occur as well. But these questions aren't posed to them. It's only posed to Bernie, as if it's slanting that it is uniquely somehow his fault that this is occurring. As well, he had no idea that this was happening on his campaign, and there was nothing he could have done about it in the first place. But as you'll see from his answer and the way he responds, he's very, first of all, proud of the diverse young freshman class that he helped get into the House. He also thinks that he had the policies in place that actually help these communities be able to localize and organize on the grassroots level, and inspired many of these people to run with organizations like Our Revolution. He gives a shout out to Nina Turner, which is more than deserved. She is a wonderful activist at getting people energized and informed. But then when Wolf asks what's going to change about the process for handling sexual harassment so that it doesn't happen again, Bernie basically responds saying that in his 2018 campaign, they put into place some of the strongest protocols to be able to address sexual harassment, and that he'll be utilizing those in his 2020 campaign. Some of those practices include trainings for all staff, volunteers, on how to properly identify what is sexual harassment, as well as hiring an independent group to be able to handle any of the sexual harassment claims that are felt by any of the volunteers on the ground, as well as hiring some people to provide oversight and consultation on policies and practice that Bernie considers some of the best in the country. So overall, I think Bernie deserves a B for this response. I think he did a very good job of highlighting how he has helped people within that community be able to get representation within our government. And I think he did a good job of answering how specifically he has addressed its sexual harassment so it won't repeat going forward. The one thing that I think the two things I think he didn't do particularly well in addressing this question is, one, being able to address why being an older white man is not a factor that we should consider as much when electing our representative, as long as the policies follow suit that are helping these communities. And the second thing I think he didn't do as well as he should have is being able to elaborate that this is a much larger problem than just his own campaign when it comes to sexual harassment, and things that all campaigns should have to embrace going forward to address this problem. So let's go to the fifth question now.
Jacqueline Smith is with us. She's the circuit court clerk from Prince William County in Virginia.
Hello, Senator. My question for you is, why have you decided to pursue the Democratic nomination for president, despite the fact that you have consistently run as an independent or other party for the last 50 years? And do you believe you can get a fair shake in the Democratic nomination process in light of your electoral history?
So, this question is basically, why, as a lifelong independent, are you deciding to run as a Democrat again, and do you think you can get a fair shake this time? I'm going to give this question a C+. Biggest reason being it goes so low is that it is very clear that this, even if he wasn't a Democrat specifically, and recognized in their leadership, he has caucused with them. He is on almost 90 to 95% of issues with them. And so to try and separate him as this independent that is just trying to steal resources is disingenuous when he has helped bring so many more people into the fold of the party over his time. I also think it's an interesting way of, framing it, because if you have this repeat where he was a Democrat running in 2016 and they're highlighting him in their leadership, in 2020, are we going to bias him at all for being with the majority of Americans? 44% of people are independents, and we should not be encouraging an atmosphere of closing down and just having it be a selective process by Democrats. We should encourage independent participation within our primaries. And then in regards to getting a fair shake, I think that's a fair question, because in 2016, it was not a fair process. That's a much longer video that we'll have to get into at some point of why it wasn't a fair process. But many members, even within the DNC, such as Donna Brazile or other Democratic senators like Elizabeth Warren, have admitted as much as that as well. So I think it's a reasonable question to be framing it that way. So then Bernie responds that A, as I said, he's a member of the Democratic leadership. B, he's been a member of the Democratic caucus for 13 years now in the Senate, and in the House 16 years before that. He has won the Democratic nomination in his own state, and that he's chosen to run as an independent in his state because it goes way, way back to some of the history of Vermont. And then he believes in 2016, the DNC was not even-handed with how they favored Hillary Clinton at the time, instead of giving a fair process to both he and her, as well as Martin O'Malley back then as well. But they've now worked together, they've moved past this, and he believes he's going to get a fair shake this time. And he believes it's actually an advantage for himself to be an independent, because like as I was pointing out earlier, many people have become disenchanted with their options of both Democrats and Republicans, especially the younger generation, and that he as an independent is most uniquely equipped to bring these people back into the Democratic Party fold, so that those individuals who have lost faith in the Democratic Party for taking a lot of the special interest money and being more beholden to their interests are willing to have faith again that it is going to be working for them. So I give this grade an A. I think it handles very clearly why he should be still considered as a Democrat and why he is eligible for running, while at the same time he points out why it's not a big deal that he's not a Democrat, because it can actually be to his advantage to bring people in, and that he is willing to admit that it was not a fair process in the past, but that he believes it will be a fair process going forward, because we should not have the divisive doubts that going forward the process isn't going to be fair, but it is fair to say going back that it wasn't fair, because we have the studies, we have the court cases to be able to show all of this. So he deserves an A for that answer. So then question 6, this comes now from Wolf after sitting him down. You'll see here.
Senator, will you release 10 years of your tax returns? As you know, Elizabeth Warren has decided to do that.
Yes.
So this is a pretty simple one. This is a mainstream narrative that has been running for a while of when are you going to release your tax returns. So Bernie did release them the last time, but it wasn't the full form. It was basically just a summary sheet. And the reason being for this is that he wasn't the nominee, and historical precedent has been you only release your tax returns if you are the nominee. So now the standard is Elizabeth Warren is trying to set a new standard, though, and that standard is even if you are now just trying to become the nominee, she is releasing 10 years of her tax returns. And so they want to know if Bernie is going to be doing this and what caused the delay in the last time from them being released. And then finally, this time, if he does decide to release them, when are you going to release them? So I think this question deserves a B-. I think it's a very fair question in asking, going forward, are you going to release your taxes like Elizabeth Warren has? Because I think it's setting a new standard, and it's fair to compare yourself to other candidates, and it's a standard that we should hold. I think the problem here is more of the basic negation that he released anything last time in 2016, or that he was required to, being that it was not a standard that was set at the time. Yes, it would have been great if he had set that standard, but it was not a standard at the time. So I think it gets a slight knock in that regard. And let's see, when Bernie answered, I got to say this is probably one of his bottom 3 answers. So let's give that a check.
What was the delay? Why haven't you done that so far?
Well, you know, the delay is not, it'll bore, our tax returns will bore you to death. It's simply nothing special about them. It just was a mechanical issue. We don't have accountants at home. My wife does most of it, and we will get that stuff out.
So when do you think we'll be able to see your tax returns?
Sooner than later.
Well, what does that mean?
Soon.
Soon?
Yes.
Are they ready to be released already?
I think that we have to just do a few more little things, but to check them out. But they're ready.
And why didn't you do it the last time around? You were under a lot of pressure to do so.
I wasn't under a lot of pressure. Well, I didn't end up doing it because I didn't win the nomination. If we had won the nomination, we would have done it.
All right, Senator.
But again, I don't want to shock you, Wolf. They're very boring tax returns.
We'll look forward to seeing them. All right, Senator. Thank you very much. We have a lot more.
So basically, Bernie's answer is first, yes, he's going to release his tax returns, and that they're going to bore us to death. That the last time they didn't do it because they were facing some mechanical issues, since he and his wife do them rather than having an accountant do them, and that he plans to release them soon after making some slight adjustments. He says his taxes weren't released last time, again, like I said, because he didn't win the nomination, and he would have done it had he been the nominee. So I gave this a B-. Reason being is twofold. Reason one is to say you're still working on it and having to do some slight adjustments is a little suspicious for a group that's already weary. Saying you haven't released it beforehand, hearing that you still have tweaking on it is not great. And then additionally, for him to not commit to any general time frame other than the generic soon was a little bit lacking. It would have been great if he said, I'll have them all released by the debates, or I'll have them all released by 2020. Some conservative goal in which to have it done by. In which it'll be very hard for him to fail to have it released by then. So I think this is lacking, and it'll be something that can continue to be used as an attack against him until we finally see it. And if there are delays in that release, that's going to be even more so of an attack. So I think he didn't do himself any help by not giving any timeline and by admitting that they're still tweaking on it being done. So let's now go to question 7.
Senator, we have a question from Young Jung So, a student from Massachusetts who's studying political science and finance.
Hi, I'm a student at the George Washington University, which touts an impressive $73,000 sticker cost. The current trends in America show the cost of college continuing to skyrocket as the workforce is becoming more and more reliant on seeking employees with a higher education background. As president, how will you work to alleviate this issue?
So, this question is basically, how are you going to address the rising cost of the demanded college education? So this is a very important question. I give this question an A because this is an exacerbated problem for many individuals my age. Luckily, I personally went to a public university and did not need to take on any debt to go there because I went in-state. So many people, though, are taking on tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt, and some personal friends I know going on for grad programs are taking on the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. So this is a growing problem in our economy where you have this degree that is more demanded, but the cost of it is going far beyond what inflation is having for the overall economy, with tuition going up, doubling in the past, 30 years. It's simply just doubled. So when we have an education system that is now the equivalent to essentially a high school degree, and now you're coming in tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt out of school, it's a problem that they're not easily able to do things like be an entrepreneur and invest in a new business idea that they have, or be able to buy a new car for when they want to go work at a new job, or be able to take on a more expensive rent now that they likely are coming from a university town and moving to a big city. These are problems that everyone needs to address, and let's see how Bernie answered. He basically answered that we're now living in a competitive global economy and that we need the best educated workforce in the world if we want to compete. That 30 to 40 years ago, we used to actually have this best education system in the world, but we no longer do. And as I said, hundreds of thousands of people can't afford to go to college. Some do go to college, but then are burdened with $50,000 to $100,000 worth of debt. And he believes the answer to this, to higher education, is treating it like it's the new equivalent to a high school degree from 50 years ago, by making public colleges and universities tuition free and lowering the amount of debts that students hold. So then he kind of trolls Wolf a little bit by saying, Wolf's going to now ask me how I'm going to pay for this, in which he gets a little crowd applause, and Wolf's like, well, yeah, how are you going to pay for this? And he goes, well, we're going to put a speculative tax on Wall Street trades. And then finally, if we can give these big tax breaks to billionaires and companies who don't need it, then we can make public college and universities tuition free. So I think he, again, gets an A. It's about prioritization, and it's about the ever-growing necessity for having this type of a degree if we want to compete in a global landscape, as well as unburdening these individuals who are coming out of college so that they can more actively participate in our economy. So I think that gets an A. So let's go now to question 8, which is a basic follow-up to this previous question.
Should private universities be held responsible for the very high tuition that's going on right now?
So he basically asks, should private universities be required to look at their costs right now? So I think this gets a D. It's a really dumb question. It's not the government's responsibility to be dictating how private, essentially companies, private institutions, educate their populace and how they charge for it. It is, if they want to be able to go to college, we want to be able to give a competing service to those private institutions by having this public alternative. So I believe this is a dumb question because it's basically trying to force Bernie into saying he is going to force certain regulations or force certain quotas of price capping on companies like these private institutions. And I think it's a trick to try and get him to seem like he's overly socialist in dictating how these top tier universities are administering education. So this, though, the way Bernie responds, I'd say is another one of his bottom three answers. So let's give that one a check.
I think they need to do a lot of examination, and some of them are. And
What do you think they should do?
I think maybe they don't want to build huge football stadiums. And I think maybe they don't want to necessarily pay their football coaches far more than they pay anybody else on their faculty. But I think as a nation, we are going to have to take a hard look at higher education, and not just higher education, by the way. Talk about education, talk about a dysfunctional child care system where working families all over this country cannot find quality, affordable child care. So we got to get our priorities right, not for tax breaks for billionaires, but for education for all of our kids.
So his basic answer is they need to reevaluate their costs, and that there are some ways to potentially do this, such as lowering how much they pay for football coaches and football stadiums. I think this question deservedly gets a C. It's really poor. That is not the reason why education costs are going up so much. Not because all programs are investing in significant football programs. A lot of the reason happens to do with the administrative costs. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they were originally relying on public funding for a lot of these things. And now when we've pulled back our funding levels on these universities, they're now passing those costs on to the consumer. There's additional ways to go beyond, tuition as well. We could try and combat the costs of dorming in those areas. We can try and combat the price of books as well. So I think there was a lot of areas he could have pointed to there, and going after football programs is not a great way to do that, because that's just going to fire up some red-blooded Americans who love some football. Mostly conservatives will be like, oh, they're going after college football. These socialists are evil. They can't take this away from us. So I think he just did himself a disservice by not answering it in an actual serious manner. So now for the next question.
A question from Nikita Kachru, a nonprofit worker here in Washington.
Senator Sanders, can you make a simple, persuasive case as to why socialism is preferable to capitalism?
So this question is pretty straightforward. Can you make a simple and persuasive case as to why socialism is more preferable to capitalism? So I'm going to give this grade an A-, and in large part, it's due to the similar clarification that Bernie even gives when he gives his answer. And that is, she frames it as socialism versus capitalism when Bernie himself is not a socialist. He is a self-described democratic socialist, which I too am a member of, but he actually governs more so like a social democrat, which is, again, similar to my political philosophy, in that you are putting social programs, universal social programs, on top of a capitalist framework that pays for them, as well as regulating the capitalist system so that it is not egregious in creating inequalities, so that you have more money in the hands of people who will actually use that money and then reapply it to the economy by buying goods that they need, rather than storing and hoarding that wealth. So let's see his answer to this, because I think it's one of his top three answers. So let's give it a check.
Tell you what I mean by that, so we're clear. Right now, we have a nation which prides itself on a lot of political rights. In other words, under the Constitution, thank God you have freedom of speech. Media can do its thing, even though Trump calls you an enemy of the people. How does that feel to be an enemy? That's another story. All right. I won't question Wolf.
You don't think we are, though?
No, I don't. I certainly do not. So we have political right, freedom of religion, and all of that is enormously important. But you know what we don't have? We don't have guarantees regarding economic rights. And way back in 1944, in a little known, a little publicized State of the Union speech, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said something, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said, you know, when we talk about human freedom and rights, we've got to understand that everybody needs a decent paying job, that people need health care, that people need education. And all over the world, these ideas are taking place. You go to countries in Scandinavia, of course, health care is a right. Higher education is free. They have strong preschool programs. They make sure that their elderly folks can retire in dignity. These are not radical ideas. So what democratic socialism means to me is having in a civilized society the understanding that we can make sure that all of our people live in security and in dignity. Healthcare is a human right. All people should have healthcare. You can't get ahead in this country, in this world, unless you have a decent education. We have got to, as a right, end the kinds of discrimination, the racism and the sexism and the homophobia that exist. So to me, when I talk about democratic socialism, what I talk about are human rights and economic rights.
So, as I said, he first clarifies that the difference between him being a socialist and being a democratic socialist. Then he goes to give his definition of what democratic socialism means to him. And that's, in America, we pride ourselves on our political rights, such as, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And, he makes mention that people like Trump call people like Wolf the enemy of the people, and that he doesn't believe the press should be considered the enemy of the people. But that our system doesn't have guarantees on economic rights. And he goes on to refer to a State of the Union address that FDR delivers, in which he states that we all need a decent paying job, we all need health care, and we all need education. He references that these are rights that are already being provided in Scandinavian countries as well. I think that Bernie deserves an A here for one big reason, and it made it feel almost like a novel moment in history, is understanding what are rights. We have long said, can I do this action? Can I not do this action? Am I truly free is what we are trying to establish by giving ourselves these rights. But freedom is something that also requires to have a lifting of the economic burdens so that you can have balance in your life, because we're not truly free if we can't actually, do things like taking a vacation. We are not truly free unless we can leave a better life for our kids than our own. There are certain economic principles that we must all hold dear that everyone should be entitled to. And I think he does a great job answering that and showing that it's already existing in certain places today and that their populations are happier and healthier from it. So, Wolf follows up here, as you'll see here.
Senator, President Trump said in his State of the Union address, and I'm quoting him now, America, this is the president, America will never be a socialist country. Will that hold true if you're elected president?
So he basically states that Trump says that we're never going to be a socialist country again. And is this going to hold true under a Bernie Sanders presidency? So I'm going to give this question a C+, because yes, it's important. President Trump just called this out. He is trying to start a conversation in this nation about whether or not we should be capitalist or we should be socialist. but it gets a C plus because, as Bernie just alluded to, he is not a socialist. He is a democratic socialist, and even more so, he governs like a social democrat, which doesn't believe in an actual socialist economy, but social programs. And if Bernie was elected, he believes that we are going to be a nation where everyone gets health care. Public colleges and public colleges and universities are going to be tuition free, and the minimum wage is going to be moved to at least a living wage of at least $15 an hour. I personally think that it needs to go beyond that, but it's a very good starting point to be considered a living wage. And whether Trump likes this or not, he's going to have to deal with this because, human rights also extend that our kids and our grandchildren are also going to need a world that is inhabitable for them. And it's an embarrassment that our president rejects science and denies that we have caused climate change and that we must address. So I think he deserves an A here. Main reason being is he doesn't try to accept the modicum of being a socialist like Wolf is trying to bait him into. And he says specifically what he's going to give the American people, which are programs that are already very popular according to the polls, and saying, this is what Trump is preventing you from having. I will give you that. And I think it's a very good way of framing. It's not a debate of socialism versus capitalism. It's a debate of, should we have programs that people want and are effective and cost controlled and that everyone can have access to? Or do we want to live in a system where it's free for all that supports the wealthiest keeping their money and making the rest of us struggle for what's little left? So now let's go to the 11th question.
Let's continue with climate change right now. Michelle Gregory has a question. She's from the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Hello. My home, the lower Eastern Shore of Maryland, part of the Delmarva Peninsula, is estimated to be one of the first places in the country to experience the effects of climate change. In fact, with more and more frequent flooding, it already is. What is your plan to help these rural communities in the poorest part of our state to fight climate change?
So this is a pretty simple one and a very important one. What is your plan to address climate change? As Bernie was alluding to in the past question, I think it was a great transition into this question of handling the subject of climate change, which is an ever-growing threat that we need to handle in a little over a decade. We are facing radical problems in having species die off, water levels rising due to Arctic ice melting, more severe weather occurrences like hurricanes and forest fires that are ravaging our country. And that if we don't do something soon, we're going to be paying for it one way or another. So we should be starting now and acting boldly on it. So I give this question an A. So Bernie decides to answer here basically saying, a couple of years ago at a debate, he was asked what the major national security threat to the U.S. was. And Bernie basically answered that it was climate change. And he was subsequently laughed at. But now they're not laughing because they too have realized how much of a threat it is. He then goes on to basically state that we need to take action on this within the next 12 years. It is a thing that not only Trump is going to try and stop, but it's also the fossil fuel industry. And that we need to make a transition from this fossil fuel to sustainable and green technologies. Luckily, we have already got these technologies, and they're only becoming more efficient and cheaper. We're going to eventually, invest in other efforts like weatherizing our homes, as well as transforming our transportation system, and then also moving even more aggressively into solar, wind, and other sustainable energies. He then basically wraps up by saying we must accept that it's a moral responsibility to leave our planet as a better place for the next generation than it was given to us, and that he's going to need to lead an international effort to combat it, because this is something that we cannot handle just alone. And I think that's a great way of framing it. And overall, he gets an A- because he shows that A, times have changed and people have again come to him understanding that he has the right position. Secondly, he shows the timeline in which we need to handle the solution and some solutions to actually go about that. But he also goes and makes an argument about how we need to have an international coalition on this, which is important because it draws a similar comparison about how we can't just place the burden of trying to address the environment and climate change on an individual level, but we need more structural changes, and that's why we need government intervention to be able to do that, because the majority of these wastes come from corporations and not just individuals, and so we need their action to take place there. The one reason why I'm knocking this down to an A- is this is a very easy opportunity that he missed to be able to bring up the piece of legislation that he co-sponsored, which is the Green New Deal. I think he failed to do that. It's a bill that now has significant amount of support, with, I believe, 80% of the country now supporting the Green New Deal. So I think he had a failure there to say that he was deeply involved in that, he had co-sponsored it, and that is something that we should get past. So let's go now to our 12th question.
From Obina McAllister. She's active in Maryland Democratic Party activities and a mother of two.
Most countries with developed economies offer public preschool as a standard benefit to all of their 3- and 4-year-olds. America does not, as we know. Instead, low-income parents here scramble for scarce public spots, while middle-income families scrounge to pay for increasingly costly private preschool. Very few can afford the cost of quality care. If you become president, will you support efforts to offer high-quality, optional, publicly funded preschool for all Americans?
So it's basically, do you believe we should have a publicly funded preschool program? This is a great question. This is an A-level question, and it's pretty simple. We have a system that doesn't listen to facts. We largely know from scientific research the most important ages for childhood development are from the years of 0 to 4. And that by having no systems in place to be able to educate these people, they're missing out on valuable years of education that leads to better results in the long run, as well as lower violence rates if they're educated at that level. It also burdens many of these parents who cannot afford preschool with having to potentially take time off of work to be able to get to take care of their kids, or have to, pay out of pocket for very expensive childcare with little educational value that comes from that. So I think it's a very good question to ask, what are we going to be doing about our preschool education system? And I think Bernie knocks this out of the park. It's one of his top 3 answers overall. So let's give that a check.
Want a one-word answer? Absolutely.
Yes.
All right, and I'll tell you why. Thanks for asking that question. This is an issue that does not get enough attention. Every psychologist in the world, what do they tell us? They tell us that the most important years of human development are 0 through 4 for intellectual and emotional development. And yet we have a system which is basically dysfunctional, as you described. You have workers who are underpaid, and yet you have parents, working class people, who cannot afford the care that they need. And many kids are not getting the kinds of nourishment, intellectual and emotional, that they need. And you know what all of the studies tell us? Is that when you invest in pre-K education and you make sure that kids are prepared for school, they are much less likely to drop out. They are much less likely to do bad things and end up in jail. Every dollar you invest in preschool education will be paid back many, many times. So we got a lot of work to do in education, from higher education to preschool to improving our public schools as well. And when people tell me we cannot afford to do that, I say we cannot not afford to do that. This is the future of the country.
So this has to be my favorite part of his speech. It's the very beginning, and it speaks to why people love Bernie so much. He is not going to be a politician that tries to dance around the edges and, obfuscate what his point is. He basically goes, do you want a one-word answer? Absolutely. It gets straight to the point. yes, I support what you just wanted there. And he thanks her for that question because it really is that important. And he goes on, like I was just saying, to tell us that the scientists have discovered that these are the most important years of development for our children from those ages of 0 to 4. And that we have workers who are underpaid, yet they must constantly have to pay for the increasing cost of childcare. And they are struggling to do this because they're not in preschool. By investing in pre-K, education leads to, lower dropout rates for, once they get to high school, as well as I said earlier, lower crime rates as well. And that each time we put $1 into our education, the returns on it are many times over. Finally, he basically goes on to say that lots of people who actually work in the areas of education say that this is something that we need, and that for those that say we can't invest into our education, that we cannot afford not to invest in our education. And I think this is very effective because it's something that I've been saying all along, that taxes are not inherently bad. Taxes are inherently a collective decision to invest into our country for programs that will help as many people as possible, especially the vulnerable. And that, as he was alluding to, the return on investing in our education is many times over. Specifically, it's 7 times over. So we can't afford not to invest in our education. It would be silly of us to miss out on that opportunity for those gains by putting our dollars there. So let's go to the 13th question now.
We have a question from Osaro Grayson. He's from Baltimore, Maryland. He's a Howard University student.
Thank you, Senator. In a political climate where we see the current president and his followers using terms such as fake news or alternative facts, how do you plan to have a productive discussion with somebody who is unwilling to accept facts?
So it's basically, how do you plan to handle a president and his supporters who reject basic facts and still have a productive conversation with him if he was the one who ended up on the debate stage with Trump? And I found this to be a really interesting question to have discussed. Particularly, how do you handle a post-fact world? What do you do to try and say, we need to have a productive conversation, so we have to make some common concessions about what is true, so that we can see how do we actually address that. So if you simply fundamentally disagree at the outset before you even try and figure out the solutions to handle the problems, you're doomed from the start. So I think this is a very interesting question to have every nominee need to answer. How do you handle a post-fact world? And so Bernie then answers, when Trump attacks our press, calling them the fake news and the enemy of the people, he is making an attack on the fundamentals of American democracy. Bernie makes sure he basically does not only reach out just to progressives when he campaigns, but also to Trump country as well, so that he can bring them the facts that Trump isn't following through on the promises that he made when he was campaigning in 2016, and that he's only serving the billionaire class. He believes that he is capable of converting many of these Trump supporters with a working class focused agenda. So I found this to be a B-level answer, not because anything was particularly bad, but because there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy. So it was a pretty just, standard answer. I am going to talk to his supporters. I'm going to bring them the facts that he's only working for these billionaires. So I don't think it necessarily added a lot to the conversation, but it wasn't a failure in any respect on how to answer that. So let's go to the 14th question, which now comes from Wolf.
A Democratic presidential nominee, and you're on the debate stage with President Trump. How will you engage with him?
Well, we'll bring a lie detector along. And every time he lies, it goes beep.
And this is basically a follow-up to the question of how do you handle Donald Trump and his non-fact-based approach, especially if you come to the debate stage. So, how are you going to engage with him? And I give this question a B+, probably because it's important to understand what is the strategy going into debating with Donald Trump, because we need to know, are you going to try and punch with him and, name call? Are you going to try and go above it and try and stay above him? And Bernie, I think, does a decent job here. And he obviously, like always, lets his personality shine out a little bit more. And I love the first one, which the crowd does too. And even the media has picked up too. And that's him answering, "We'll bring a lie detector along." And I do love this, because it's not pulling punches, but it's not, going after the character flaws of him, of, him being a misogynist or a racist, which people can get defensive on because it's a more subjective attack than lying, where you can show video evidence or a document that goes explicitly against the actions of what they did. He then goes on to say he had conservative friends that are honest people and that he can respectfully disagree with them on the issues. But Trump's not that, and he's broken his campaign promises time and time again, such as Social Security and healthcare. And I love this fact, not only because he incorporates the humor at the very beginning, but because of the attacks that you're going to bring against Trump. Having the lie factor, which is so easy to show, I think does a lot of service to Bernie, because whenever he usually speaks, he brings his figures with him. He brings his polls, he brings his sources. So I think having a president who is truth-based is something that the American people are sorely missing, and so I think he did a great job here. So let's go to our next question.
Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator, we have a question from Troy Dante Presswood. He's a community leader here in Washington. Hey,
Thank you, Senator, for being here. The intelligence community all agree that Russia tampered with the 2016 election and used information warfare to sow further division and mistrust among Americans. It's likely that they will interfere with the 2020 election as well. So as a candidate, how will you ensure your campaign will not be infiltrated by Russia? And secondly, as president, how will you eliminate this threat once and for all to restore confidence to our electoral process?
So he basically asks, the entire intelligence community agrees that Russians engaged in cyber warfare to try and interfere in our elections to try and influence Americans. How can you assure your campaigns won't be infiltrated by Russians? And how, if elected president, would you handle trying to end this issue of not being able to trust our electoral integrity once and for all? So I found this question to be a B. Main reason is, one, it shows a lot of faith, in our intelligence agencies, when we've known in the past that sometimes they're not completely honest with us. I think we should believe them, but we need to verify against other sources as well. So just using the intelligence agency is not a great source. Secondly, I think the framing of the question, basically saying it won't infiltrate Bernie's campaign, not it won't infiltrate any campaign, is something interesting, because there have been a lot of our more centrist-leaning colleagues who have made mention of the idea of Bernie being a Russian asset because of his campaign manager, Tad Devine. And I think that framing is a little interesting. But how do we regain our electoral integrity once and for all is an interesting question, because this is a debate that can be very divisive. If we can't trust our elections, we will not be able to remain a successful democracy. So I think this is, unfortunately, one of the things that Bernie Sanders didn't do a great job on answering. I think this is, again, one of his bottom three answers. He basically goes, and I'll show you it here first.
Thank you very much for that question. Unlike Donald Trump, I have no doubt that what you said is true. And clearly, we have got to make it clear to Russia that they cannot sabotage elections, not only in the United States, by the way, but in countries around the world. Specifically, we are, and I know other campaigns are doing it as well, hiring, spending a lot of money, trying to protect our computers, etc. But ultimately, the word has got to go out to Putin and others around the world that cyber warfare, the attempt to destroy American democracy, is a very, very serious offense which will not be taken lightly.
So, unlike Donald Trump, he says he has no doubts what he just said is true, and that we need to make it clear to Russia that they can't sabotage elections in the United States or anywhere else in the world. That Bernie's campaign and many other campaigns are spending a lot of money trying to protect campaign computers, and that we must make it clear to the global community that cyber warfare is a very serious offense and will not be taken lightly. So I give this a C for two big reasons. So one, it lacks the specificity in actions taken by the Russians. So what is the specific offense that we are calling for? Is it trying to influence the election through memes? Is it through the cyber warfare, trying to hack into the DNC to get the WikiLeaks email dump? What were those specific actions that Russia took that you are taking offense to? And then secondly, what are the consequences if we do catch you doing that again? Bernie Sanders, being a more pacifist candidate, has always been less inclined to try and go to war. So is it going to be economic sanctions? What type of consequences are they going to face if they do it again? So I thought that was a pretty mediocre answer on his part. So let's go now to the next question.
We have another question. I want to bring in Chanel Saldana, student at American University here in Washington. She's from Pittsburgh.
Good evening. In light of the recent events in Venezuela, you came out against U.S. intervention, a contentious stance as many in Venezuela are currently suffering at the hands of Maduro through starvation and violence, and it is clear that he will not let humanitarian aid in. Under these circumstances and moving forward, do you have a clear position on U.S. intervention overseas, both economically and militarily, for nations that are under the regimes of these oppressive dictators?
Thank you.
So, it's basically, you came out against the intervention in Venezuela, and this is a contentious stance among the Democratic Party because many people are suffering at the hands of Maduro, and he clearly won't allow aid in. Do you have a plan when it comes to handling dictators on when it is appropriate to intervene militarily or economically? So I give this question a B-, in large part to the way specifically the Venezuela situation is being handled here. As you've seen in my past videos, I've covered the Venezuelan crisis, and especially the part that I take some offense to is the aid portion of her comment, because we as a history of the United States have used these similar tactics beforehand, especially when it's led by people like Elliot Abrams, who are now leading our effort with Venezuela when it came to the Iran-Contra crisis, and how we basically, in our efforts to give humanitarian aid, actually sent weapons to help fund these rebel groups. And that can lead to untold casualties that are on our hands. So I think they are rightfully weary of letting in aid into Venezuela, especially when they did not request it from the United States. They have received aid from other countries that are more closely their allies, and institutions like the Red Cross and the UN have said that the U.S. should not be sending this aid in. It's kind of a propaganda effort to try and further exacerbate that Maduro is a brutal dictator, not allowing basic goods to his people, when there's even video evidence showing that it's not necessarily a matter of shortages on these basic goods. It's more of a problem of the hyperinflation to be able to get those goods. So I disagreed with the framing she gave there on the Venezuelan part, but I think it's actually a really interesting question on how do you plan to handle dictators around the world that are doing these brutal things to their people, and when does it call for intervening either militarily or economically? So I think it's a good question, but I didn't particularly like the framing of it. So then Bernie basically goes to answer saying there's a lot of awful things in the world. What's happening in Venezuela is a disaster economically. An international humanitarian effort must be taken to improve the lives for those people. and that the last election was not free and fair, and he wants an internationally supervised free election. But he also remembers the war in Vietnam and the war of Iraq, and he is fearful about what the United States has done in the past to overthrow freely elected people in these other nations that have not ended up all that well, and in fact ended up causing more harm with our unintended consequences. So he basically further states that we must treat dictators consistently, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, and that we need to encourage an atmosphere of democracy. So I thought this was a reasonable answer. I would give him an A-, and I think the reason I'm doing this is more so on how you treat dictators as a whole in his approach, and saying we must treat them consistently, that we must foster an atmosphere of democracy, that it's not okay to just be a dictator. But some of the comments on Venezuela are lacking. I think it would have been nice if he could actually clarify that point I made beforehand on the humanitarian aid. But he is right. The situation in Venezuela was not the most democratic situation that occurred. There are still some democratic operations, but with such a depressed turnout, it would be good if we can ensure this democracy is still a democracy and have an internationally supervised free election. So I thought overall he did a great job, but it would have been nice if he could have brought more clarity to why that aid part can be seen as an effort of propaganda.
Why have you, Senator, why have you stopped short of calling Maduro of Venezuela a dictator?
So then Wolf clarifies with Bernie, asking basically, why have you stopped short of calling Maduro a dictator? And I'd give this question a C+. I think the reason I'd give it a C+ is, one, Bernie is trying to be painted as basically a supporter of Venezuela, when he is very actively trying to separate himself from that, while also trying to keep us as the U.S. As much as we can out of the situation, while still trying to help their people. And it's clear from his statement beforehand that he sees the situation as a non-democratic one. The reason I think he wants to hold back on calling him a dictator is pretty clearly obvious, because by using rhetoric like that, you make it easier for people to say, well, why aren't you intervening? And it makes it an easier cudgel to paint. And basically Bernie answers, it's fair to say that that last election was undemocratic, but there are still democratic functions taking place in the country. And the point he is calling for is internationally supervised free elections. And he wonders why we care so much about the election in Venezuela when we are not placing nearly as much care on the election that took place in Saudi Arabia, because there was no election in Saudi Arabia, and that the abuses in that country are just as egregious, and we need to be consistent when applying our standards against these dictators. So he basically finally says the people of Venezuela must be the sole people determining the destiny of Venezuela. And I think this was a reasonable answer. I think it deserves an A-. The only one knock is he didn't specifically try and take on the question. I think he should have, and I think he needs to evaluate more his position on Venezuela over time and the messaging behind that. But overall, I think the point of him getting across that it has to be the right of the Venezuelan people to self-determine is a good one, and overall he gets an A- for that. So let's now go to the 18th question. Again, another question by Wolf.
As you know, President Trump this week is meeting in Hanoi with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. If you were president, would you meet with Kim Jong-un?
So this question is basically, would you meet with Kim Jong-un to try and, create peace? And I think it's a very valid question. Do you meet with dictators to try and negotiate peace? It's a question we've always said. Do we need to have concessions beforehand before we meet them? Do you only speak with allies? what type of language do you use leading up to that? So I think it's a very fair question, especially with it being also a current event topic as well. So basically, Bernie answers that, after all the nasty things he said about Trump, he actually wants to take a moment to praise Trump for how he handled North Korea. He basically says that nuclear weapons in the hands of a brutal, reckless dictator is, always a bad idea, but that it's a good idea to meet face to face with our adversaries and bring other nations in conflict together to try and make peace. He wishes the president the best of luck of getting, the nuclear weapons out of the hands of Kim Jong-un as well. So I think this answer deserves a B+. I think it's good that he is actually willing to, not make every issue that Trump handles negative. I think it's actually good that he was willing to look past that and see objectively that even Trump handled this more correctly. Is everything he's doing on this topic perfect? No. He shouldn't be complimenting Kim Jong-un, that's just flattering a dictator unnecessarily. He's also not doing all of the work, but I'm glad he's at least sitting back and allowing the South Korean president to be able to do the majority of the negotiation. And I think it's also would have been more interesting if Bernie made some comments on how to encourage a good faith conversation with dictators that are trying to possess nuclear weapons, if we show our own good faith denuclearization efforts as well. So I think that's a missed opportunity for him. So I'm going to give him a B+. It's a good answer, but it could have been improved further. So now let's go to the next question.
We have a question from Regina Brennan. She's a student at Catholic University. She's from Philadelphia, a supporter of yours. She has a question about the president's border wall with Mexico.
Good evening, Senator. My question for you is, if Donald Trump does get his wall, do you believe that it's worthwhile to adopt a plan onto your platform for deconstruction? Or with so much happening, not in just terms of undocumented migration, but of immigration in general, to adopt such a plan will deflect from more pressing issues?
Yep.
So this is basically, if Donald Trump gets his wall, do you think we should spend the effort to tear it down? Or if instead that spending of efforts would be better focused on other initiatives? I think this is a B-level question because it is interesting to know, should we be spending effort and resources tearing down symbols of hate? Because this goes beyond just the wall too. It also goes to, the Confederate monuments as well. So I think it's interesting just having a question on, should we prioritize spending effort just tearing stuff down, even if it's not going to necessarily create economic benefit? It shows who we are as a country. But on the other hand, I'm giving this a B because it doesn't take into account like the actual political situation currently, which is showing that it's very unlikely that a wall will get built. So it comes from that presumption that it will get built when very likely it won't get built. So I think it's a B-level question in terms of the pertinence to the current conversation that we need to be having. And so Bernie answers this question by saying, in Bernie's judgment, Trump's not going to get his wall, which, thank you, Bernie. That's giving an update to everyone we know it's not going to become a thing. He had to call a national emergency, and even Republicans are now embarrassed by his actions. So the effort is outrageous, and that, as I just said, the Republicans are seeing his lunacy now, and that Trump is now speaking towards his authoritarian goals, and that the actual emergency at our current situation is a lack of a comprehensive immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship. That we currently have 1.8 million individuals who are eligible for the DACA program, who are now fearful that at any moment they could be deported to another country after living their entire lives here. Finally, we need a process to humanely handle asylum requests at the border so that children are not being stripped away from their families. I think this answer is pretty good because it doesn't, waste all that much time on are we going to actually take down the wall, because we basically are saying we never think it's going to go up in the first place. So I'm glad he kind of went past that and didn't try and handle that question directly straight on. But the one thing I would have liked a little bit better, which is why he gets an A- instead of an A, is giving a little clarity of what that pathway to citizenship looks like. my presumption, and he left me to only assume here because he didn't give the info, is a program very similar to what DACA was currently, and having those same standards apply to new immigrants who are wanting to become citizens. So let's go now to the next question.
Bernie Sanders. Senator, I want to bring in Devon Bradley. He's a student at the George Washington University here in Washington. He's from Florida. Devon, go ahead.
Thank you. Senator, my question to you is this. How do you plan to ensure the cost of medications like insulin won't continue to rise and that people over profit will hopefully become the norm in this country?
So this question is, how do you ensure the cost of medications like insulin, so basically necessary medications for yourself to stay alive, not just like superfluous medication that improves life but doesn't save life, will not continue to rise, and it'll instead prioritize people over the profit. So I think this question is quite good. I think it deserves an A-. I think the one reason it deserves a slight knock is I think he should have been more clear in how he framed it in just saying life-saving drugs, because I think certain people, when they think of insulin, they don't necessarily understand that fact if they don't have to deal with someone who is diabetic in their family like I have. So I think it would have been great if he just said and other life-saving medications, so that the point was more clear that it wasn't just about insulin, but it was more all life-saving medication. So it's only a very minor knock there. So then Bernie basically answers that this is something that he's worked on for a very long time, which is totally true. One of his first efforts as the mayor of Burlington was to take elderly people and help them get across the border of Canada to be able to get cheaper prescription drugs. So he has been fighting on this his whole life. So then he goes on to say the pharmaceutical industry is the greediest industry of all, that 1 out of 5 people cannot afford the medicine that they need, and that we have had on the Senate social media, parents say that their children have died because they cannot afford insulin. They pay ridiculous compensation to their CEOs, but let people die not being able to afford their medication. Elderly people in his own state are cutting their pills in half now on the regular. And he currently has legislation out there that would allow Medicare, first of all, to negotiate prices with drug companies, because this is something that the rest of the industrialized world does, negotiate prices with their drug companies, but we in America uniquely just let drug companies dictate prices to us. That makes no sense, does it? That prescription drugs are needed to have a free trade deal so that we can bring in these cheaper drugs from other countries like Canada, as he has done in the past. And that he even brings up a policy that the Canadian government has implemented, which is saying that based on the average price of a drug in the world, that is the price that they should be charging for their own drugs. And he says that this is a policy that we should consider bringing into the United States. He then goes on to say it's going to be tough to defeat the foes and their greed, but guess how much they spend in even just one state on like one referendum. And he goes on to say it's $131 million. He also goes on to mention why he made a call specifically to get a 1 million-person campaign, and how on the day of that town hall they actually reached that goal. It's because you don't defeat the pharmaceutical industry in DC. The only way you do it is when you get millions of people to stand up and say that, no, you're not going to let people die because they can't afford the prices. I think this is an A- level, because I actually would have really liked Bernie to champion what he had done in his career. I think it would have been a really good point to show that he cares about this issue, and it's not just him giving filler and pointing to him being old and experienced in politics. I think it would be a really good service if he could remind people of what he's done on that effort. So it's a very minor knock. I think he should bolster his already strong career there. So now let's go to the next question.
We have a question from Noel Asama. He's a policy analyst here in Washington.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. There's a deep sense of mistrust for you by some within the African American community. Many feel you undermined Secretary Clinton after her nomination by not showing enough support. and which contributed to President Trump being elected. Along with that, many also feel that you are at times racially insensitive and by virtue of your background don't reflect their experience enough. How do you address these concerns and what's your approach to winning their votes?
So he's basically stating there's a lot of mistrust for you among the African American community, that you did not show enough support to Secretary Clinton after she had won the nomination, and that contributed to Trump getting elected. Some believe you can be racially insensitive at times, and virtue of your background don't think you reflect them enough. How do you expect to win their votes? So this is the first question I'm going to give an F to, because this is a statement that is very clearly just trying to smear him. Because one, the polling data that he cites is blatantly false. His highest popularity is among the African American community. And secondly, the notion that he cost Hillary Clinton the election in 2016 is outlandish. There was a multitude of factors that contributed to her loss, most of which was her own platform and campaign and not actually going out to the places she lost, like the Rust Belt. So I think even to imply that Bernie Sanders had a hand in her losing is outright laughable when he was going to those states, as he goes on to mention, that he did 35 to 40 events in all the battleground states, and that even Hillary Clinton herself wrote a letter saying, "Thank you, Bernie, for all the work you did to try and get me elected." So basically, he flat out rejects that point that the question asker is giving, and it's silly that he is being implied in helping get Trump elected. So then he goes on to address his second point. And he also goes to say how he actually won the younger group of people of color, and how he had more votes from them than Trump and Hillary combined. So it's a notion of more young v. old within the communities than it is that he is uniquely bad with the African American community. That's just not the case. It just happens that the older generation of African American individuals comes out to vote more often than the younger individuals. And then he basically states that maybe he hasn't been as strong as he needed to be on this issue in the past, so he wants to make himself clear, which I think is fair. Bernie has definitely had his stumbles when it comes to having dialogue around racial lines. He basically goes on to say, yes, there are general inequalities that exist, but those issues are further exacerbated by with the wealth gap when it comes to race between black and white Americans. And this leads to issues like infant mortality rates being 2.5 times higher, and the cost of college leaving more African Americans deeper in debt due to them not having wealth beforehand, to be able to buy a college education. And then finally, they have found cases where he references a businessman from Milwaukee in which banks are preventing them from getting loans due to redlining, and that he promises to work his hardest to be able to address these racial inequalities by having, first, a cabinet that reflects what America is, and I think he's done a great job of that so far with the cabinet that he has shown, with people like Ro Khanna on it, as well as the mayor of Puerto Rico, Carmen. I'm blanking on her name at the moment, but his campaign team is quite versed, as well as the last member being Nina Turner, of course, who helped him with Our Revolution. And then the second area in which he goes on is a little bit more generic. He says he will work to end racism in all of its capacities. So I think that he deserves probably an A- here. I think it would have been great if he could have shown this more as a call out to his past works of helping those communities. I think this is actually something, being that I just came back from the Bernie Sanders Brooklyn rally today, he needs to speak more to his past and his upbringing and the work he has done, because he has been there trying to help in the civil rights movement. Was he the main contributor? No, but it is something that he has held dear to him his whole life. And he did do things like helping organizing within Chicago to lead the first sit-in on housing discrimination at the University of Chicago. So I think he needs to talk more about his own history and not be afraid of, saying who he is. So let's now go on to the next question.
We have a question from Chioma Iwaha. She works at a nonprofit here in Washington.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Part of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the U.S. is the legacy of income inequality in the U.S. What is your position on reparations to the descendants of slaves?
So this is basically, part of slavery and the Jim Crow laws in the U.S. is the history of wealth inequality in the U.S. What is his policy on reparations to the descendants of slaves? Now, this is a great question in the sense that it is a very important topic to discuss because we have largely made gains off the backs of uncompensated and coerced individuals long ago, and those wealth disparities have not closed since. So it's a very important question. I'm going to still give it an A, even despite the next point that I'm going to make, which is it's interesting that this question is being more and more thrown specifically at Bernie Sanders rather than the entire group in the campaign, and compared to giving it to presidents beforehand like Barack Obama. So I think it's interesting that it is being thrown more so at Bernie, but it's a very important question because reparations are something that we need to finally address to properly apologize to these communities, just like we have done beforehand to groups like Native Americans or the Japanese. So Bernie goes on to basically answer, yes, there are massive inequalities, as he just mentioned, that we must address. And that there's legislation by Jim Clyburn that he actually likes called the 10-20-30 legislation. It focuses federal resources on distressed communities and that they must end institutional racism because it is not acceptable that the rate of childhood poverty in this country for African American communities is over 30%. And that African Americans die from cancer at higher rates than whites, and that we need to put resources into distressed communities that have been impacted by slavery. So then Wolf basically follows up with him and states, what's your specific stance on reparations to the descendants of slaves? Elizabeth Warren and Julian Castro have indicated that they want to support it. And Bernie responds, well, what do you mean? I don't think anyone particularly has a clear definition of what that means. So then Wolf then quotes Elizabeth Warren, but basically Bernie says that she said the exact same thing as himself. So then Wolf brings up that Bernie in 2016 said the issue might be divisive, and Bernie responds saying it really does depend on what the word means. And then Bernie jokes that, at Wolf, I know you don't want to be divisive tonight, in which he gets a nice applause break for that. I found this answer pretty poor on Bernie's behalf. I think it warrants a C. I think he needs to fix his stance on reparations because I think most people, when they hear reparations, they do think of a monetary gain and an investment into those communities as well. It is a twofold solution. It's not just handing a check. It is also then investing in those communities. But to be kind of dense on the issue and just kind of pass it off by saying, yeah, I agree with those other people, was a very poor handle on his part. I think the stance he needs to take on this issue is more along the lines of saying, yes, I strongly agree that this is something we need to address to finally apologize to communities that have been taken advantage of for far too long in our sad history as the United States. But that we need to work out the details of exactly how much money and how we are going to distribute it so that we can give the billions of dollars back that they rightfully deserve. So I think this was a failure on his part. I was really disappointed to see it. So let's go to the next question now. All
right, let's go to Samantha Hakeem, a student at Catholic University. She's from Massachusetts.
Thank you. As a strong advocate for raising the federal minimum wage to $15, I've had many discussions with my peers in regard to this matter. Many express concerns that small business owners would have to lay off employees because they do not have the money and income to support that many workers at that rate. How do you reassure them that this would not be the case and it is in fact possible?
So basically, it's as an advocate of raising the national minimum wage to $15 an hour. It was a big issue for her. And now she has concerns when trying to convince her friends that raising the minimum wage is not going to cost jobs. So she asked Bernie, how do we assure them that that is not the case if the law is passed? And you know what? I think that's a pretty reasonable question. I think it deserves an A-. Major reason being is, first, it helps to address income inequalities by capping it at a floor so that we have a capitalist system, like Andrew Yang has mentioned, that doesn't start at zero. We are slightly above that because we're getting paid at a certain threshold. Secondly, it's important to note that even in a lot of economic circles, this is still a very controversial topic because of the fact that different economic models apply different ways of handling a minimum wage shift. Studies have shown that this has not had as much of an impact as some worry that it has, but I think it's an adequate concern to say, how do we make sure that in the pursuit of getting paid fairly, people don't get paid nothing instead? So Bernie basically says that it was a radical idea when he ran on it in 2016 to raise the national minimum wage, but now everyone has come to his position, and that 5 states have already passed it into law. It also means phasing it in over a couple years instead of right away. He believes that in the richest country in the world, you shouldn't work 40 hours a week and still be living in poverty, and that by raising the minimum wage, workers will have more money to spend in their economy, and that in turn will help create more jobs. He then goes on to say that he believes that the House will end up passing a bill to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and that he will fight for it in the Senate. So I think that also is relatively a decent response, but deserves a B+. And it goes back to also my grade of the A- for the question, and that's around the figure that they're quoting of a $15 minimum wage increase. So this is a little unfortunate hearing that Bernie Sanders is trying to take a phased-in approach, because currently, if we looked at how wages should be tracked, if it was along the lines of productivity and inflation, wages right now should be closer to $25. I personally would advocate for a $20 national minimum wage, because you can't set the price all the way to $25 because that'll be disproportionately hard to handle for rural communities. And so I think the national minimum wage needs to be slightly below the average track so that it can be raised further in city environments. And hearing that Bernie plans to take a phased-in approach, that $15 minimum wage, once it gets to us, will not be enough anymore. So if he's going to take a phased approach to how to handle this issue, I do hope that he chooses to at least keep the phasing going so it doesn't just stop at that 15, but keeps pacing afterwards, so that it can reach eventually that productivity threshold, rather than immediately after getting to 15, it then is tracked to inflation. So let's go to the next question now.
We have Bo Finley's a lawyer here in Washington.
A lawyer, all right.
My apologies. Thank you, Wolf. Senator Sanders, every Texas resident has 2 senators and a member in the House. Every Florida resident has 2 senators and a member in the House. Every Ohio resident has 2 senators and a member in the House. I live in Washington, D.C. and have no such representation. What will you do to help me and my fellow 700,000 Washingtonians do to receive full representation?
So he basically asks, do you believe Washington, D.C. should become a state? And I love this question because this was something that I had not even been thinking about. So it really helped bring a new topic to the stage. And that is whether or not D.C. should be a state. And I think they clearly should be. They have the population to do so, and they should have the representation, and that we are already battling unfair situations when it comes to the Senate. So I think it would be very helpful if we had another state coming into the fold, like Washington, D.C. Bernie Sanders basically answers he comes from one of the smallest states in America, in Vermont, and he believes it would be hypocritical if he rejected the notion of D.C. becoming a state. He strongly supports statehood for D.C., and he'll try and do whatever he can to be able to make it into a state. He admits that it will be a little bit tough because we have to understand that the Republicans don't want that, because D.C. is a pretty blue city, and they would likely get 2 Democratic senators. He hopes his colleagues do the right thing and give representation to Washington, D.C. I would decide to probably give this answer a B+, and I think the main reason why it's a B+ is he doesn't give any answer on how he would actually get it done, whether it be things like, changing the filibuster rules to be able to actually accomplish it. So I think his lacking of an answer of how to get it done is a knock on him, but he does admit that he's at least on the right side of this issue, which is giving them statehood. I also think it would have been nice if he also brought in other territories that we own and asking if they would like to become states as well, such as putting up a referendum for places like Puerto Rico. And I think he failed to address that opportunity too. So let's now go to the next question.
We have a question from Eliana Landau. She's a sophomore at the George Washington University. She's from Pennsylvania and an active member of the College Democrats.
Hi, Senator. We're arguably living in one of the most polarized political environments in American history. The Democratic Party is shifting more to the left and the Republican Party more to the right. But most Americans tend to fall in the middle of the political spectrum. How do you plan to unite such a polarized country if your policies are moving further away from where most Americans stand?
So this is basically the question is, the country is becoming more divided, with Democrats running increasingly to the left and Republicans running increasingly to the right, while the majority of Americans sit in the center. How do you plan to unite the country when your policies are moving further from where the American people stand? So this question deserves a grade of a C-. I think that it is a very poor framing when the data doesn't support that on the issues. Now, when it comes to potential political framings, people may see it as more left and more right because there's division in our country. But that largely has to do with, A, as she said, Republicans are running to the right, and so that makes it appear as if Democrats are further to the left. We've had the Overton window shift for many a decade now further to the right, that now a position that is considered more centrist in a global sense is considered far left, which is unreasonable. And I think this happenstance of framing Bernie as just this leftist who can't unite people is kind of a poor framing of a question. Bernie basically responds saying he looks at it a little bit differently, that yes, the country is polarized and a lot of it is Trump's effort to breed division and hatred, and that it concerns him that the number of hate crimes have been rising recently. He believes that the secret of going into red states is to talk to them about policies like the immorality of tax cuts for the rich by cutting Social Security and Medicaid, guaranteeing health care as a right, raising the minimum wage, giving pay equity for women, investing into our infrastructure to rebuild our roads and bridges, and addressing climate change and handling racism and sexism and homophobia. Because he believes that we are not as divided as some think. That he believes that it's far too often that people come to Washington that actually don't represent the people of their state's experiences and perspective, because they instead reflect the billionaires and corporations that donate to them instead. He believes he can build a coalition about caring about working class families and not just the 1%. So I think he gets an A- for this because it's focusing a little bit too much on Trump causing this division and hatred, and it's not a fact that politicians in general don't represent the American people's experience and perspective. And I think it would have been nice if he spoke about how a lot of it is a bunch of millionaires who are the ones in the House and the Senate, and they're being funded by a bunch of billionaires to basically give them, the billionaires, more money and taking that money away from the people who are even poorer than those in Congress. So I think it was a good answer, but it would have been nice if he tried to take it to another level. Now, for a follow-up, Wolf gives the following question.
If you're elected president of the United States, Senator, how would you reach out to Trump supporters to try to unite the country?
Well,
he basically asks, what's your plan to reach out to Trump supporters if you were elected? I think this is a B-level question, and it's because it almost frames it as it's absolutely necessary to go after Trump supporters. Like, that's how they're implying it. Like, if you don't go after Trump supporters, you're not going to win. And you have to have some strategy to go after them. So I think that's a little unfair when there is the opposite approach, which is trying to increase voter turnout, because we had very low voter turnout last year. When you consider it on a historical scale, it is slightly below average, but in the modern era of politics, it's quite low. So Bernie answers, he basically just answered that question already, that we have a crisis in this country. And he goes to give an example that happened recently of a company in Erie, Pennsylvania that sells locomotives. Basically, a new company came in and bought the company called Wamtec, who luckily got to also speak today during his Brooklyn rally. And they basically told the workers that they're going to have mandatory overtime and that they're going to reduce the pay of new workers while giving tens of millions of dollars to the CEOs. He further elaborates how this is the situation all over the country of companies cutting rights and benefits to its workers and giving massive bonuses to the CEOs with 300-to-1 pay ratios. And then he is also concerned about the impact of robotics and artificial intelligence and the effects that it may have on the workforce. And that a long discussion needs to be had with people to make sure that technology is being built that works for them rather than just for the bosses. So yes, some Trump supporters are going to be unreachable racists. But many people just work hard their entire lives and their standard of living is going down, and that the future is bleaker for their kids than it is for them. Bernie further goes on to basically detail the despair of the region that are Trump voters, where they have been ensnared by opioids and alcoholism and suicide, and that we need to stand with them on jobs, education, and healthcare to win them over. And I think this is an absolutely amazing answer. I think he deserves an A for this. The reason being is Trump supporters are looking for help. They see a lot of pressure on them caused by radical changes that have destroyed our manufacturing economy, and they are becoming displaced. And because of that, they're trying to treat these pains with things like opioids and alcohol, and it leads to depressing scenarios that ends up having some take their own lives because of it. And I think by unifying on a people first working class message, it'll resonate through to them, because we all have those same pains that we hold, whether it be making sure that the lives of our children are better than our own, whether that be having an education or not going into despair if you have to go to the hospital. There are certain key areas that we all can see value in, and I think Bernie brought it pretty clearly there. So now let's go to the final question, and this is by Wolf. He basically goes on to say the following.
Very quickly, Senator, Democrats want a candidate who can beat Donald Trump. Why do you think you're the most qualified to beat Donald Trump?
So basically, Democrats want a candidate who beats Trump. Why are you the most qualified to do it? So I give this question a B-. I get it. You kind of want to have this as the tying question. How are you going to do it? What makes you, if we nominate you, the person who's going to win? But this is kind of the first question of the entire debate, so it just feels kind of superfluous. Like, he's already told us this several times, and his previous answer kind of answered this. So I thought it was kind of largely unnecessary, and it would have been kind of great, like, what is your future for America? What is the vision of America? Something where it's the big take it on home message rather than just how do you beat Trump? So Bernie basically answers there's a lot of good candidates in the race, and some are his dear friends like Elizabeth Warren, and that he promises he's going to make sure that the conversation is around policy rather than personality, and that he believes that himself is the most equipped to win these swing states because he can bring out all different types of people around an agenda that creates a government that works for everybody, whether that's through our trade deal policies, increasing the minimum wage, increasing education spending, increasing spending on childcare, increasing spending on healthcare to make sure that all people are covered in a more cost-effective solution, and that this will win over a lot of those reasonable people who ended up voting for Trump. So I think Bernie kind of does a decent job here bringing it home, and he gets an A- because of that, because he once again focuses on his biggest strength, which is keeping the conversation focused on policy and focusing on how you help working class people. So overall, when we tabulate all the grades the question asking audience and Wolf gave, they just squeak into a B, which is fair, as there was a lot of good substantive issues covered. Questions flowed well from one subject to the next, and the topics were mixed in Bernie's wheelhouse of issues, and some outside that wheelhouse. But at the same time, there were a couple of lazy smears or unnecessary follow-ups that I think that could have been avoided. Then, when it comes to Bernie, I think he did really well and deserves to be celebrated for his performance during a town hall that, through a really tough series of 27 questions, gave him his chance to show off his oration skills and his willingness to grow as a candidate and stick up for himself against unfounded criticism, showing his skill as a politician is now reaching its peak at the capstone effort of his career. So from our scoring, Bernie received an A-, and that really shows that he is willing to allow more of his personality come to the stage and that he has a greater command of the specifics of the issues in which he advocates. So that covers our grading of the Bernie Sanders 2020 CNN Town Hall, a highly entertaining event for all to watch and learn about the issues. Before we end things, I just wanted to briefly come out and also tell you all, if you haven't seen the stream of Bernie's Brooklyn rally, you should give it a watch, because going to it left me so fired up, knowing that I was listening to our 46th president describe how we, the united people of America, are going to transform our great nation so that it works for the many and not just the few. As well, Bernie and his speakers that came before him also really gave us a great look as to the life of Bernie, who was the son of immigrants who worked hard in a lower middle class job and tragically passed on too soon. So I'm going to be including a link in the description section below. I highly recommend you go and check that out. So if you like what you watched or heard today, please make sure you subscribe and give us a like or a rating if you happen to be on the podcast, and a like if you happen to be on YouTube watching right now. It's the only way we show that the roses are growing upon our hill. Until next time, folks, stay rosy.